Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian. It's so great to be on with my friend Brendan Harris. Brendan, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Good, man. How are you doing?
Good. Real good.
Awesome. Everyone, Brendan earned his MA from Southern New Hampshire University. His thesis was entitled, "The People of California Are Devoted to the Constitution and Union, California During the Civil War," which is an awesome thesis topic. We hear a lot about the Southwest from people like Megan Kate Nelson, but California needs to get some love.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
little shout out to Tupac there, since it was his birthday. California love. Anyway. Brendan, we met last year at CWI, right? Did we?
Right.
Yeah.
Super quick.
Yeah.
I think it was actually when we were eating lunch. It was super fast. It wasn't anything crazy. And then I ended up following your podcast, and now we're here. So.
Yeah, we're here. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got to say, the food at the CWI Summer Conference is the best conference food I think I've ever had in my life.
Yes.
And I never ate so good at a conference.
Right.
So, Brendan, I went over your MA, where you earned your MA and your thesis topic. Let everyone know a little bit more about your background.
Background, actually, history was also kind of a hobby of mine. I was always reading, always visiting sites growing up, and decided to go back to school. I decided to pick something I wanted to learn in, so it was history. And then Southern New Hampshire offers a military history program, and it just kind of went from there. By trade, I'm actually in law enforcement, so kind of taking a different approach to it, but I think it kind of helped because I had a different eye for looking at information and reading over reports. I kind of used my professional background to look at how sources were made and how people wrote their reports. So it's helped. I think it's helped with writing, and it's helped me view things in a different light. So,
yeah, man. How was your experience with Southern New Hampshire University?
It's a little bit different. It's for me, it was all online. So a lot more time management. You're not in the classroom every day. You kind of have to juggle your schedule, but I made it work. And it was an interesting couple of years because I finished my BA through them too. So I just kind of piggybacked with my MA and then got it all done. So
yeah, now everyone's online.
Right now, everyone's online. So when I hear my friends and other people that are kind of stressing out about online, I tell them, you can do it. It's just a matter of if your professors set up the classrooms for, the way you need to, so that you can be successful. So,
yeah, you almost need more, in some cases, more willpower to do it because,
yes,
you're sitting on a nice comfy couch instead of in a classroom sometimes with your laptop.
There are several times where it's like, oh, let's not do till Sunday. I'm all right. I've got time, and then it's Sunday morning, and you have 4 hours to complete it. So
yeah,
time management is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. So when was the spark lit for history, Brendan, in your life?
Growing up, I was born in Virginia, so visiting family, it was always there. And then as I got older, I just kept reading, and then when it was time to start figuring out, with school, and I wanted to get it done, I gravitated towards it and just hit it at full tilt. So I stuck with what I knew. Civil War has always been a passion of mine. So I just stayed in my comfort zone and just took it as far as I could. So I would definitely say growing up in Virginia helped with all the battlefields, literally, an hour away from each other, depending on where you live. I grew up in Fairfax, so I had everything at my disposal. It was just a matter of having someone drive me if I didn't have a car. So it piqued my interest. So my family, I think, got really annoyed with me at some point in my life because I would either always be watching Gettysburg or always watching some type of documentary. So I'm sure there was some eye rolling in my household at some point, but I stayed with it. So
that's awesome.
Now we're here.
Yeah. A lot of us grew up that way, where it was like, oh, here we go. Here's another documentary. I think I wore out 2 sets of the VHS of Ken Burns by the time I was done. So yeah, I totally Understand that. Where are you residing now, Brendan?
I live in Sacramento, California. So,
Okay.
Yeah, it's where I work. It's a little bit different, but history is a little bit different out here too, because we're so far removed, and that's kind of how. When I ended up deciding to write a thesis, I tried to combine my background and where I used to live to where I live now, and it just kind of, I was able to make it work. So, and found a lot of interesting things. So it definitely helped.
What was your research like for your thesis?
It was a little bit different, just because I obviously had the official records, like most graduate students or anybody does, and I started there, and then it was more a matter of taking the official records and then seeing what local archives or local history that I could find. And it took some digging, but eventually I was able to string some things together. One of the bigger things in Sacramento, there's a memorial grove in near the state capitol that, when it was originally designed, it had all trees from all the different major battles during the Civil War. And these different places sent the trees to the park, and they planted them, and it was a very large piece of the property there. There's only 3 trees left of the original 30 that were planted.
Wow.
But just there are little things like that, and then it was just more a matter of, okay, how did that start, and then going backwards from there to tie it all together. So
yeah. That's awesome. That's great. I didn't know about these trees before.
Most people don't. I mean, most people who live in California, in Sacramento, don't even know. So,
yeah.
And that ended up being a journal article that I wrote, and then I just ended up tying more into the thesis at the end for more of a kind of a reconstruction of memory type of approach. But yeah, I mean, it's here. I would definitely say that Civil War affected all parts of the United States. It's more just a matter of finding the history and finding the connections.
So, yeah, and historical memory of the Civil War in California would be amazing, to consider.
Right.
I'm sure you have, and I'm sure others have. Me as an Easterner, full time,
Right.
It's kind of hard to think about that, because we're used to how history is remembered here in the East. It's kind of where the quote big battles happened. Kind of interesting to see how even the veterans remembered their service when they moved to California, or just moved west in particular. I think that's an awesome thing to think about.
Right. And it throws people off, especially in California, because there was, before current events happened, there were several Confederate monuments in Southern California in cemeteries that were removed by local governments. And many people are like, I don't understand why they're here. So there's just that almost disconnect of, it's part of the history, and this did happen, and these people did move here. It just, there were blanks in the historical record of it, and without them understanding. So explaining it has always been an interesting thing to do for people. So.
Oh yeah, and we talked about that a little bit when Pete Carmichael and I talked to Megan Kate Nelson about some of the things that occurred in the Southwest in her book, The Three-Cornered War. But you've specifically tied it into California. Well, Megan did a lot on New Mexico territory and that. So you've gone into California with the thoughts of Confederate expansionism and Union, correct?
Correct. The thesis ended up, and kind of just my general research, I ended up starting all the way back in the Mexican War, because everyone looked at California, north and south, as, okay, we want the natural resources. We obviously want the gold and silver, but this is a new place that we can get raw goods for. And ended up finding a lot of speeches and letters from Jefferson Davis that even in the late 1840s and early 1850s, discussing how we need to expand and also put slavery there, because in his mind, if they could take slaves and use them on plantations, they could easily be used in mining to get more gold and more silver out of the ore deposits in the Sierra Nevada. And reading that now, looking back, it's like, wow, okay. Obviously, there was a plan there even before the Civil War started, and then moving forward, it was still in their minds as all the battles and everything else were occurring in the East.
Mm-hmm.
So it started there, and then obviously you've talked about the New Mexico campaign before. That was the first real push west, and if they had actually succeeded, then who knows. But there was definitely a need to expand, because the South understood that they needed more land than what they had. They had plenty of it, but they wanted to expand just as far as at that point the North was. So, but yeah, that was the starting point, and then it just went forward from there. So it
it's the Mexican-American War is one where a lot of people gloss over it, with how it transforms the antebellum period. A lot of I'll call just popular history fans, we tend to gloss over the Mexican-American War as nothing more than just a training ground for the Civil War, when in actuality, it was basically us doing a land grab, let's say, saying we need to have our expansionist ideas to the coast, not only for resources, but just because it's there. It's like we need the land.
Yeah. Correct. And then when you also look at it too, from once that expansion does happen, most of the officer corps on both sides end up residing in California for a very long period of time. So you have Grant, you have most of the officers in Northern Virginia at the brigade level all cut their teeth in California. And then by the time election 1860 happens, they need to leave. So there's this mass exodus of California of officers going back north and south. And from the standpoint of the South, that also gave them an opportunity to maybe expand, because they knew that there wasn't much in the standpoint of a military presence in the West. So the idea was, if they could quickly expand, it could prolong the war, and it could also give them more resources that they were losing towards the middle and the end of the war in the East. So
right. Were there secessionist movements in California? Or
there were.
Okay.
There were several. 30% of the West Coast was still considered strongly Southern by the start of the Civil War, and they still felt close. Most of California, up to the state election after the 1860 presidential election, had Southern ties in the state government. So they were very much on the fence about what to do, even though they were a northern state and a state of the Union. There was a lot of discussion as to what California should do. Some people obviously wanted to stay in the Union. Some wanted to break away, split the state in half, and then others wanted to make a completely separate republic and be neutral during the entire conflict. So then that way they could keep trade open between the North and the South. So a lot of this was going on in the early part of the war, but because of the time and distance from the rest of the conflict, it doesn't really get discussed. So you have this constant back and forth between both sides in the state until more Republicans get elected in the state at the higher levels in the state elections. So it sometimes say California acted more as a border state than a union state for most of the war, because there were these little pockets of fighting. Something else that I also found in the research was you had large groupings of Knights of the Golden Circle, which at first I always laughed at, because the first time I really heard about them was the National Treasure movies. They kind of use that as the the linchpin in the second movie, but with newspaper accounts and how they're actually officially recognized in some of the reports, it's okay. This was a serious thing that at the state level and the Union Army felt in California at the time, they could possibly do something that could disrupt the amount of gold that was going east and being sent to Washington, D.C. So that was very interesting. And they the state government ended up passing a law where anyone that was aligned with the Confederacy could be imprisoned and or put to death, depending on what their severity was. So,
wow,
something that doesn't really show up in the state history books for sure. But it was a statute nonetheless, and it was on the books for a very long time. But
were the ideas of secession in general, as in secession to join the Confederacy, were those ideas seen throughout the state or only in certain parts of the state?
More where you had bigger, denser pockets of Southerners living.
Okay.
California was a major population hub at the time, so you had a little bit there, but it was mostly in central and southern California, where you have a lot of the farming, and people basically move to where they're comfortable with. So you had a lot of Southerners that owned land from wherever they were coming from, and they settled in areas where there's a lot of farming. So in those type of areas, you had more pockets, and it's just how it worked out. Northern California ended up being more pro-union, and Southern California ended up being union, but also had deeper secession ties. And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that the major routes going back east came from the south. So your route from Texas was a major artery. So a lot of it came from that part of the country as well. So
wherever if you had a route from Texas to California, along that route, you saw more secessionist feeling because they're more involved with the connection with Texas.
Correct. And then you have your Northerners came over what would be Utah, up to the northern side, and it was just a natural migration. No one went south to go west. They just went straight across. So it's just kind of how it worked out. And then once they got to California, they obviously spread out. At first it was everyone was looking for gold, so they stayed in the Sierra Nevadas. And then as that vein started to dry up, they started to expand. So for the state, that was a huge issue for statehood, was what kind of state it was going to become. Was it going to be a free state? Was it going to be a slave state? Do they split the state in half? Eventually they went as a free state, but there was always the tension of most of the Southerners. We want to be able to maintain what kind of life we had in the past. So
it's kind of like what Niels Eichhorn and I went over, in that the ideas that they brought from Europe transcended over to here, and it's kind of like something from Texas transcends and Utah transcends along those areas, because they're not only is there human interaction, but there's also people bringing their political beliefs with them, obviously, into the yeah, that's pretty awesome. Mike Froning, who you might have met him at the CWI. I've met him at the CWI. He said that both governments have formal policies and war aims geared towards California.
They did. Simply, the North wanted to keep California as is, and as a Union state, in a way out of Confederate hands, because they did not want to have to fight another front. They've already were heavily involved in the East and even in the West from a Eastern perspective, but they wanted to make sure that the state stayed within Union hands. And for the Confederacy, it was the same all the way. They wanted expansion. They wanted control of the state all the way through until January and March of 1865. Jefferson Davis wanted the War Department to have plans to expand to California. Now, if that meant going through Mexico, then so be it. But he wanted a route west. On the transverse, Abraham Lincoln wanted to make sure that there was enough either volunteers from the state or a Union Army present strong enough to combat whatever was coming from the Confederate side. One of the letters that I found from General Grant to General McDowell in January of 1865 was asking what steps had the Department of Pacific taken to defeat or stop any Confederate movement from the West. And General McDowell's answer was that he had beefed up the volunteer force and moved everyone to all the possible entry points from the Confederate, moving from east to west, from Texas into California. So that meant New Mexico, and that also meant the Mexican border. So it was very much on their mind. I believe it was secondary to a certain extent, obviously, because of where all the heavy fighting was. But I do believe both sides were prepared for an eventuality that it could expand, the war could expand farther west. Now, with Grant taking Vicksburg, that slowed the Confederacy's ability to shift forces to the west, and it was basically left up to Texas and units from Texas to try to carry out the fight. But as a general rule, they didn't have a overall specific war policy to be constantly be shuffling troops to the west to move into California. So
right. If Davis is thinking about, traversing into Mexican territory, he must not be too worried about what Mexico is going to do against
them. And that is a couple of his envoys were actually Californians. It was William Gwynn was one of the first U.S. senators from California, and he had Southern ties. And he was actually, as an envoy, sent to Mexico to talk to the government of Mexico at the time to secure either an area where Confederates could go to either travel, and by the end of the war, as a more or less a safe haven to start over again if the war ended unfavorably. And depending on which reports and which reminiscences you believe after the war, many felt that Davis was trying to get to Mexico after the collapse of the government. Because he was obviously in Georgia, but the idea was he may have been trying to go farther south and farther west to get into Mexico to try to restart things. And but then again, it just depends on which reminiscences you want to believe. Some of those were written well after the end of the war, and there could have been some hoping of better days,
right,
by some of the Confederate generals that were writing what they believed happened. So,
for you to know, Brendan, and for everyone watching, I'm glancing over here because the comments aren't coming up as quickly on my main screen here. So I'm watching the comments come up over here. So I'm catching some questions at least 20 seconds before they pop up on here. So if you guys are asking questions, I'll catch them over there. Brendan, I did want to ask about, in your research, did you find anything on the indigenous populations in Southern California?
I did. One of the things, and it's a part of what I ended up doing part of my thesis on, was the Confederate threat was obviously there. It was always an issue, but the Native American threat was in their mind, was another issue because of the fact that they did not know if Native Americans would try to side with the Confederacy, because of the fact that they were pushing Native Americans out of where they were living and trying to push them onto reservations. And at one point, the Union Army was trying to take Native Americans from Northern California and sending them to the Channel Islands in Southern California to live, just so that they were out of the way. And in some instances, some of the bands went peacefully, others it was not, and then it turned into what basically amounted to a massacre. And several of the policies in place used by the Union Army in California and New Mexico during the Civil War with Native populations continued into what would end up being the Indian Wars later in the 1870s. But these policies were crafted and thought of during the Civil War, and it was not something I was expecting to find, but there was plenty of evidence to show that that was a huge issue, at least in the Union Army's mind, as they need to deal with what they considered a hostile threat. Now, there's no evidence that they were attempting to side, the Native Americans were trying to side with with the Confederacy or any other groups to take land back. But I think there's a little bit of paranoia from the standpoint of the state government and the Union Army as to who the enemy was, because for them, they felt they were completely secluded. They weren't getting any help from Washington. It was all up to them. The Department of the Pacific had the least amount of manpower, but the largest in square mileage of what they had to defend, and it was basically from California up to the Canadian border, and then all the way out into parts of the Dakotas, almost, depending on which map you look at and how it was cut up at that time. So they generally dealt with things very, very quickly because they didn't know where the next threat was going to come from. So,
do you think that's why a lot of historians possibly haven't tackled these issues, is because there's such a wide expanse of places and information and sparse logistics and that kind of thing?
I think so. It's not as I would say the action wasn't as much as, let's say, it's much easier to look at something, let's say the Peninsular Campaign or the Antietam Campaign than, okay, what happened in 1862 in California? Well, there was a lot of drilling. There was a lot of, well, maybe this could happen.
Right.
Maybe it won't. So it would almost be you're doing research from a personal level. These people are obviously dealing with the same type of issues. They're involved in the war, but it's almost an outsider's perspective because the events are coming piecemeal, and you're not feeling the pinch until much later. The title of my thesis comes from the proclamation that the California state government made, that they were pledging their oath to the Union, and they were also supplying money. We didn't send a lot. There was only one regiment of troops that were sent back east to fight during the Civil War, and they were part of a Massachusetts volunteer cavalry unit. Everybody else stayed here. So the only thing, we exported gold, but other than that,
right,
from a personnel standpoint, we tried to just basically take care of the West Coast. So it a little bit different. And from a standpoint of archives, it took me forever going through the California State Archives to find things. It's there. It's just, not. The history out here is more focused on what happened, the gold rush, and then what happened after the Civil War, because then you've got more people coming in, you have more railroads and everything else. So finding that information is much more spread out than.
It's interesting you bring up railroads, Brendan, because someone asked, was the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 a conscious effort to keep California politically and economically in the Union camp?
Yes, because at that time there was also a state, that 1862 was the state election that brought most of the Republicans in, and directed the state towards, okay, we are staying in the Union and we are backing what the president wants. Now, obviously, it took much longer to build a railroad because we still had to get through a war. The Union had to win it, and then they started building it. But the idea is okay, we need your support. We are willing to back you, but we need some assurances on the front end. And that's also another reason why that particular railroad ended up going north instead of south, because there were plans to build a Southern Pacific that went from Texas across, but it never gained steam in the 1850s because we went through the antebellum period, and then we eventually hit the Civil War. So that after the war, it ended up happening eventually, but the focus was more tying into northern economies than southern economies. So
it makes you think of the importance of the railway in getting those messages of union in,
right.
winning the hearts and minds, so to speak, of that quicker. And if that southern terminus would have been involved, that would have really escalated things, I would think, right?
Right, exactly. By then, at that point, before the telegraph system was put in, you had the Pony Express, and the Pony Express ran across the, I always call it the Donner Pass trail, because that's basically
Yeah.
which way they were going, but it came over the top that way. It wasn't coming from the south across. It was coming from the north. So until telegraphs were put in, that was really the only constant news source, unless you were getting a steamer from Panama, because that was the only other real way of getting information quickly. So
yeah, I think Brian is asking about antebellum, or not antebellum, but 1860, 1861. Brian asks, how were California residents impacted when the military leadership left for, I reckon, the Confederacy?
There was a void. Economically, there was a void because there was no troops. There's basically no troops left to feed off the local economy, and you ended up seeing these volunteer units spring up literally overnight. And they had to drill. You had some regular Army troops left because you had to man the forts, and they were building up forts all across, especially San Francisco Bay. You had Fort Point. Alcatraz was really, for all intents and purposes, a fort until they ended up turning into a prison. But you had a triangular defense in San Francisco Bay from whatever they thought could be coming through there, because if Confederates had a strong enough naval presence to come through there, you basically would have tied up where all the gold was coming from. So so there was definitely a void that had to be rectified, and it was left to the state until there's very little in the standpoint of troops coming back from the east. So other than leadership, like I had said, General Irvin McDowell was eventually sent out to take over the Department of the Pacific, and he kind of remade himself after First Manassas, and in his earlier exploits in the East, he kind of refound himself by being a good organizer and setting up the department once he came west. So
yeah, that I saw that Steve Fan was on here from he was watching from Civil War Defenses of Washington, and we're all about forts around there.
Right.
Kind of interesting when you look at San Francisco. It's almost a smaller version of Charleston, South Carolina.
It is much smaller.
You have that triangulation of forts, right?
Right, and you have that choke point coming through the Golden Gate. Obviously, there's the bridge now. That bridge wasn't there, obviously, during the Civil War, but that geographic feature was there, and the idea was that you had Fort Point right there. There was another fort that they ended up building on Angel Island, and then you had Alcatraz. So anybody coming through there that was an enemy would have had a very tough time coming in. So
yeah, I didn't know there was one on Angel Island.
They haven't quite built it up. It is a historical site it's a state park. It's not a national. It's not it's not an MPS site. It's a state park, but they do reenactments there and that sort of thing. And they're trying to bring up the history of it a little bit more. But but that was the third point in the triangular defense of that particular harbor. So
yeah, that's awesome, because I know that a couple people who follow the page are reenactors out that way, and they do living histories right underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. Fort,
and that's Fort Point.
Yeah, and it's so awesome to see that, where it's like 2 centuries colliding right there.
Exactly. There's plenty of pictures of people that visit where you've got the fort, and then you just see that span of the bridge is just right there. So.
Yeah, and to have people realize that Alcatraz was a fortress before a prison, and a lot of people forget that's the original design, is that almost as a Fort Sumter like thing right in the center of the harbor.
Well, and they're just now starting to dig down and find the foundations of the original fort.
Oh wow!
So that, hoping at some point they'll turn that into a tour instead of just the prison. But they're finally getting there, where they're digging past the prison site, and they are finding the Civil War era archaeology. So
how did Fremont's legacy impact California as far as the Union cause is concerned?
Well, he was very much about himself, but he,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
So, how can I put this? Him being about himself and him living there, and for him, he felt that he helped found California because of his earlier exploits into the state, and always talking about it and bringing it up in either his own autobiography or letters and such. But I think that it helped bring more of an idea of what's out in California, he and his wife, because they were both very vocal about what was in California at the time. Even towards the the middle of the war, she was still living in San Francisco at the time, so she was always very vocal, and he was too, to a certain extent, about what's there. Fremont, California is named after him, so I think after the war you see a little bit, but it I think once you removed them from the equation, or as time went on, I think he's kind of become a little bit more of a forgotten part. He's more just another name on something here, as opposed to everything that he had done in the state during the Civil War and before the Civil War. So
yeah, I knew there were instances where he got under Lincoln's skin quite a few times, because he would be in his headquarters more than he should have been, and dining.
He enjoyed himself. He is more about enjoying himself than.
Oh yeah, he lived the good life. Yeah, he definitely lived the good life. Michael Reinhardt asks, is your thesis going to become a book? Is there enough information to make it a full-length book?
I've been asked this a couple of times. I've talked about it with people. It's kind of one of those things that's kind of sitting there. There is more. Obviously, with the thesis requirement, I had to cut down how much information I put in there, because they didn't want me to go too far off kilter. I probably used about 20% of what I found research-wise.
Wow.
So I think it's just going to be more a matter of, if I go that route, is it going to be more of a broad full length, or if it's going to just be kind of more of a general history, because there is things there, but haven't quite set myself up to completely tackle it yet.
Yeah.
I dawdle with it, and I'll add more here and there. I've been kind of compiled a list of all the different Civil War sites within California, and just kind of doing a real quick synopsis of the site, what's there, and what the relevancy is within the state. So that's kind of starting to take on a mind of its own, and I wanted to include it in the thesis, but the powers that be said they wanted me to cut it down a little bit, so I complied. So so we'll see. I'm not going to say no, but I won't say yes.
Right.
On, where that's going to be, but there's definitely enough information that if I expand, it would definitely be there.
I was going to say, if you've only used 20% for a thesis, I mean, my God, you have a big work.
It's one of those things where I was looking at stuff, and then all of a sudden it was like, okay, I have a lot here that I just didn't know was there. And you start doing the research, and you do a finding aid, and you start looking at boxes of documents, and all of a sudden you're way down the rabbit hole with it, and there's a lot more than you expected, or what's explained in the summaries of what they have. So
are there any books, Brendan, that are done on California in the Civil War in a large scale, or has it been a while since one has been done?
There's been about 11-12 years ago, there is a book that predates the Civil War. It's the California Gold Rush and the Coming Civil War.
Okay.
That was one that was done, and then there was one done about 5 or 6 years ago that was kind of a general history, just entitled California and the Civil War. It was put out by it was the History Press in Charleston. Kind of gives that particular one gives a general narrative of just different things that were going on in California at the time. But nothing nothing so deep where, where it's more of a, I won't say academic, but just there hasn't been a deep dive book yet. So,
right. So you're 20% of the way there.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta give a shout out to an interpreter says that he reenacted at Fort Tejon.
Oh, that's Southern California.
Yeah. So there you go. There's a guy that's into the forts in Cali. Yeah. So which is only the way you say it on the East Coast. Nobody in California, right. Cali.
Yeah.
I know the rules. I know the rules.
it's always you come out here and Californians are always like, oh, everyone has accents. It's like, no, we have accents in California too. It's just very neutral. We don't really sound like anything. We're not really from anywhere. So
yeah. Well, when I go to Ontario, everyone says I have a weird accent. So it's I just don't speak the way they do either. So, no. But who, when in your research on this subject, who was one person who just stuck out among the rest to you? Who's one person you're like, wow, this person is just the guy or the woman to be moving this along?
There were two that really stuck out. On the military leadership side, there's General George Wright. He was one of the commanders of the Department of the Pacific during the war. He was the one that ended up implementing a lot of policies that helped the state stay in the Union. He worked really closely with the governor, whoever the California governor was, and the state government, to just make sure that there weren't a lot of unrest. He was responsible for making sure that the forts were properly manned across the state to deal with the Confederacy. He was also one that implemented a lot of the Native American policies. He was one that wanted to show fairness towards Native Americans, but he understood how the civilian population was, so he felt he had to do something, even though he may not agree with what the result was. So he ended up dying in a boat at a ship. His ship sunk as he was being sent to Washington to take over a department up there. So he doesn't get a lot of, like most people during the Civil War, you die before you can get your autobiography out. You kind of get lost in the shuffle. And then one of the on more of the civilian side, there was a Unitarian minister named Thomas Starr King that was believed a lot in the Union cause, and he basically spent 2 years going up and down the state talking about abolitionism, why the state should stay in the Union, and he didn't just stay with pro-Union crowds. He would go into these secessionist hotbeds, try to explain to them, why slavery was bad, why the Union would prevail, why the country needed to come together. And he basically did this for 2.5 years straight, going up and down the state. And he ended up dying basically from exhaustion. He was living in San Francisco. He came home from a trip, said he was tired, went to sleep, and just never woke up. And now that name sticks out because there are some schools in the Sacramento area that are named after him. There are some parks, but again, another one of those types of things where no one really talks about him. There was an autobiography done with him about him right after the war ended, but other than that, doesn't get a lot of attention. But in some of the papers, even by Abraham Lincoln, he discusses how Thomas Starr King is the one who saved California for the Union, and it's in his own hands. So he obviously had enough of impact that he caught the president's attention. So those are two that stuck out the most for me, because I had heard a little bit about Thomas Starr King, but nothing about General Wright until I started this research.
So where would first I would say that you just brought up a great point that any students watching who are like, we can't find anything else on the Civil War, find someone who doesn't have a memoir written about them, or they didn't have time to write their memoirs and start researching those people, because they're usually the ones that are first lost to history, right?
Or find somebody who, the only thing written about them was something close to the end of the war. The 1870s, 1880s, a lot of material obviously got written. I mean, not as much now, but there's a lot going out, but then none of it gets touched.
Right. Yeah.
Current day. If it hasn't been touched recently, you may find something farther back, but not too recent. But.
Right. If someone wants to visit a part of the state, maybe they live in one part, they want to visit a Civil War site or an archive where you're finding a lot of your information. Now we can obviously do that, but after everything is settled, where are some places you would tell people to go to check out some Civil War history in California?
So I'll break it up geographically because the state, pretty much covers 7 states back east, depending on which way you drive. In Northern California, so up by me, San Francisco area, Sacramento, the state archives are located in Sacramento. They're downtown. They hold a lot of the information I found. And then from a standpoint of sites, there's several in San Francisco. You have the 3 forts that we just mentioned. There's more throughout the state. There's a lot more just plaques as opposed to sites of just different things that happened. In Southern California, there's the Drum Barracks Museum, which has a small repository of information, and that was on the site of one of the installations that the Union Army built in Southern California. And it's not too far from Disneyland, so you can kind of, do a 2-for-1 depending on if you're traveling with family or not. But site-wise, it just depends on really what you have. Some of the forts with plaques, some of the forts still exist, but they're just kind of scattered throughout. We just mentioned Fort Tejon. There's a site there in the Grapevine that going through Southern California. It's kind of one of the last stops before you go up or down the hill, depending on which way you're going, north or south. That's there, and it's got some great, interpretive things. It doesn't arise, I would say, to some of the bigger things back east, but it's still there and it still exists. A couple of more obscure monuments or places. I kind of touch them in the thesis. There's a town called Volcano, California, that had 2 militia groups that backed both sides. Kind of had a little argument, and one side, the Union side, brought a cannon and shot it and almost blew it up. Blew the cannon up because they overloaded it. And the cannon still exists. It's in the center of town, and you can look at it. You can walk up to it and see it. It's behind a cage.
Oh my God.
And then outside of Placerville, California, kind of in the mother lode, there's a marker for the Bullion Bend raid where Confederate partisans ended up doing 2 stagecoach robberies full of gold and silver coming from Nevada, and tried to ship it east for the Confederacy, but it turned into a whole manhunt, turned into a shootout, and one of the trials for one of the people of that raid actually ended up going past the end of the Civil War, and he wasn't hanged until the end of 1865. Wow. So those little things, and pretty much for California, that's how it works out. There's these little snippets, little events that have occurred, and it's been interesting to find along the way. But
yeah, we have a shout out in the comments to the Huntington Library in San Marino. Obviously, also has quite a few documents of the Civil War. That's a good shout out there. So we have another place on the list. We asked, or we inquired with Megan Kate Nelson about theaters of the war, and I think this is huge when you're coming to CWI Summer Conference and you're coming to the East Coast, and as I say, the East Theater is the Beast Theater, in Civil War history. How do you see, as a person living in California now and writing this thesis, how do you see the theaters of the war? Do you see, when we talk about the Western theater in the Civil War, everyone thinks of Shiloh, And
Right.
you see it as different as well, like Megan Kate Nelson does.
And for me, I do. And I guess living back east and growing up with that point of view and then coming out here, for me, it's a constant clash, because I will say the West and I'm thinking California, when the other half of my brain's saying, no, you're talking about Vicksburg. So I see it both ways. But out here, if I talk about the Trans-Mississippi Theater out here, someone looks at me like I don't know what I'm talking about, because to them it's the West. So I kind of have to almost gauge how I discuss it with people based off of what their knowledge is. If I'm amongst my peers, or if I'm at CWI, I will adapt so that it makes sense. But if I'm just talking to someone either at work or out in public and they're asking me a question, I will say the West, and for them, the West is here, where in my mind, I know it's something else. So I've kind of have had to chameleonize how I discuss it. So,
because I think Megan said something about it's East Trans-Mississippi and West to her.
Right.
So basically Shiloh is an Eastern theater thing.
Right.
And basically the Mississippi River divides
its own
Trans-Mississippi, obviously. Yeah. And then I don't know what the dividing line is for West. I didn't get into that, but it's kind of like, where does the West start and Trans-Mississippi end?
Right.
So it's an adapt and overcome thing, like you said. Like when you come out here, it's the old school way of interpreting the Civil War, right, as far as theaters are concerned, and then you get out to where you are, and it's the new school way,
exactly,
of breaking it.
And it depends, and it also depends too on how other people have been taught too. 'Cause if they have a Eastern view of it, they're going to look at it differently than if it's only been out here. So,
so what would you say to anyone joining us tonight who wants to think about California and the Civil War? What would your advice be to them as your parting advice for everyone?
My advice to them would be like that California was part of the Civil War. It did exist. It may not have had the impact that, other states did in the East, obviously. I even go to great lengths to say that in my thesis, that I don't think that California was, more important, but it kind of brings the conflict to a broader scale. It affected everybody, and it affected all states in the Union, and regardless if it was 3,000 miles away or not, that it did reach out and affect everyone. So that would be the biggest thing, would be that it really did. I think some people hear, that the Civil War, affected everyone, and they almost it almost to me sometimes sounds cliche, in a cliche type of way, but really it did. It reached out and touched everyone. Battles were, fought here. The ideas of expansion did bring the entire country under, some type of duress at one point or the other. It may not have been intense or possible like it did in the East, but it was still very much there and on their minds. So I think that the fact that it was so far removed, kind of did shelter them and put them in a bubble a little bit, but it was still talked about. There was still that concern, and it was still discussed all the way up till, the end of the war. So
it is kind of ironic, right? That the issue of the expansion of slavery into places like New Mexico and California is what leads to this spark igniting this epic clash. And yet the places where they were arguing about the expansion of slavery are kind of pushed to the side. And it's kind of like, oh, that's way out there. We don't need to worry about that right now. It's kind of ironic, but it's so American now. It's like,
It is. No, it totally is. It's like, and, and that's just how it ended up playing out. My thesis, I really try hard not to do the what if game, because that, someone else can do that. I just followed where the evidence took me. So but yeah, it's very much a twist on, it became one of the, not the only reason. There were obviously several other things that have been built up over time, but it was definitely a pivot point that shoved the country closer to what ended up happening. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, Brendan, I really appreciate your time, my man. It's been
All
great
right.
having you on, and I hope that this thing becomes a book, because
Okay.
you got so much more information, man.
Yeah.
I want to hear in a future CWI when I'm interviewing people. I want to be like, when's the book coming out? Come on.
All right. I'll
You know,
start
that's my
working on it.
challenge. That's my challenge
right.
to you. So that'd
Okay.
be awesome, man. But I really appreciate you coming on and being a part of this, and being able to give California some love tonight with this Civil War history, man. This is great.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks for all the comments, everyone. You've been great. Thank you for the questions, letting us know where you're from, letting us know some of you are actually from California, which is great. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all here in future presentations. And Brendan, once again, thank you, my man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.